they basically found a completely demolished Jeff Beck. He had gotten completely thrown out of his car onto the pavement, cracked his head open, was in a terrible state. If he'd have been a less talented man, might have completely killed his career at that point.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, conversations with authors, musicians, and insiders revealing the stories behind classic rock's greatest songs, albums, and artists. I'm Eric Senich. Great to have you with us again. Before we get started, if you'd like to support the podcast and get episodes commercial free, and before they arrive to the rest of the world, sign up for the Backstage Pass from Patreon, just $5 a month. Link in the show notes or go to bookedonrock.com. All right, now on to our guests. Brad Tolinski and Chris Gill, authors of the critically acclaimed oral history on Eddie Van Halen, Eruption. They are back with a brand new book titled Blow by Blow, the Jeff Beck Story. Welcome back to the podcast, guys. Good to see you again.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us on.
Well, Chris, you opened the book with quite a story. This Jeff Beck story, you literally had to climb over a wall just to interview him, and it was a Cliff Gallup guitar pick that broke the ice. So if you could please share that story to get us started.
But I think people need to read it to really get the whole thing. But I'll kind of give the Cliff's Notes version here. It was basically, I had heard about Jeff being a difficult guy to interview and everything. I'm a lifelong fan, of the guy since I basically first took interest in guitar. But I was working at Guitar Player magazine, and you had people like Jazz Obrecht there, and we had this guy Ross Garnick who worked for Musician magazine, so he was there when Musician did a lot of their Jeff Beck interviews in 85 and 89, and I just heard like, oh, Jeff, man, he's a difficult dude, and so we were talking about we need something to give him as a gift, to kind of a peace offering, and we talked about hot rod parts, and then we realized we had Cliff Gallup's guitar picks from this guitar picks poster that they had done in like the late 80s when Cliff was still alive. And so I came over with that. And of course, I had to meet the muster of Jeff's manager, Ralph Baker, asked me all these questions about Cliff Gallup to make sure that I was up to snuff. And I actually had info that he didn't know about. But it was, you drive an hour, first of all, I arrive in London, from San Francisco, and I'm jet lagged. I get picked up the next morning, and actually my interview got moved up. I was supposed to go in. I was going to just go shopping. It was around Christmas time, going to go shopping in London, but it got moved up a day, which turned out crazy story on the other side of this. There was an IRA bombing on Oxford Street, which is where I was going to go that particular day that I was there. So I might have missed, being filled with shrapnel and walking around with, chunks of metal in my head. I've got other type of metal in my head, but not that kind. But
this was 91, I think, right? Was it 1992?
92.
Yeah.
December of 92. But anyways, we take this long ass drive through the countryside, through all these crazy roads, and we're on the opposite side of the road, and I'm just completely disoriented, and then we pull up to this kind of this wooded area with all these trees, and there's this brick wall and this big iron gate, and we pull up to the gate. Ralph hops out, messes with the combination lock, and it's like, keeps messing with it. And he's like, oh, we're locked out, And this is the early days of cell phone technology, so we had to drive into the nearest town, which is Wadhurst, to try and call Jeff, and he didn't pick up the phone. And it's like, oh, great. I fly all the way out here, and the guys just literally locked me out. So Ralph's like, oh, we're going over the wall then, and that's what we did. And it turned out to be the perfect introduction to the guy, because I got to really soak it all in instead of just, flying down this little rutted, these two ruts cut in the dirt, leading up to his house, because it was built in 1500s. I got to walk up there, and kind of like take in the surrounding things. And it was a decent little walk, and all of a sudden we come around this bend, and there's the house. And then up on the hillside, there's this outbuilding, and there's the hot rods, two of them just sitting out there in the mist, collecting water on them and everything. And it was just like, wow, here I am. It's like, this is like real rock star territory. This is the rock star mansion thing that you kind of, that fantasy you dream about and everything. But yeah, it was, It still was tough when, Beck opened the door and turned his back on me, and then we sat down and did the interview, gave him the picks, and boom, 3 hours went by and we talked, about all kinds of stuff. And, turned the tape recorder off, hung out for another couple hours, got invited back for another 2 days.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, you guys hit it off. But the big thing was the Cliff Gallup guitar pick that broke the ice.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. So between the two of you, and I'll throw this next one over to Brad, between the two of you had roughly 40 hours of interviews with Jeff before writing the book. But even after all those interviews, still huge gaps in his story. So talk about the additional interviews that were done and the goal of understanding how Jeff worked and why he kept reinventing himself.
Well, that's why this book, in some ways, first had to be written and was, fun and challenging to write. Because when you're looking from the outside of Jeff's career, it sort of goes all over the place. And part of the thing that, part of the mystery and part of the thing that Chris and I wanted to solve was how does this 50-year career that he had, 50-plus-year career, how did it all fit together? How did he go from being the psychedelic guy to the hard rock guy to the funk guy to the fusion guy? And it was sort of difficult to find out. I mean, it required us to talk to, guys that were in the Yardbirds with him, conversations with Jimmy Page. At one point, I had a conversation with the great record mogul, Clive Davis, who a few people don't know this. I mean, Clive Davis was the great CBS record executive. And they talk about how he signed, Whitney Houston and all these other people. But he played a huge role in Jeff Beck's career. And thank God he did. When he signed Jeff in the early 70s, he signed Jeff to, it was almost unheard of, a 10-record deal. And then basically gave him the freedom to do whatever the hell he wanted to, which is, why we get this tremendous variety of output from Jeff. He wasn't really as constrained by commercial concerns as most people have been. And you know what happens when you give an artist, full reign?
Like an artist like Jeff Beck, full reign. That's the thing. It's not just
You
any
actually
old
get
artist,
something cool.
but
Sure.
it's Jeff Beck,
You get something cool, and you get a bunch of stuff that's cool.
Yeah.
And he continually pushed the boundaries even right up to the end. I mean, when we got into the 2000s and I heard you had it coming.
You had it coming, yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. I loved it. I just embraced that. But I thought it was so cool that he was not stagnant. He was not lacking inspiration or drive or the need to push further, where a lot of artists may get to that point, but he just kept pushing forward.
I was just listening to Rollin' and Tumblin' off of that.
Yes.
I mean, he took an old blues song, perhaps one of the oldest blues songs, and then just completely, revamped it and hot rodded it for that record. It turned it into basically a techno song,
Right.
Really
I just love that he did that. His sister, Annetta, is important because she introduced him to so much music. She also suggested that he see a film called The Girl Can't Help It. You described Jeff seeing that film as almost like a religious experience. For those not familiar with the film, tell us about that and why was it so important? Why did it have such a profound effect on Jeff?
Well, his sister, Jeff was just starting to get interested in rock music. And his older sister, Annette, said basically, you've got to go check out this film. And the film had all these rock guys that nobody had really seen. I mean, media wasn't like it was today. So there are all these different famous rockers of the day, Eddie Cochran and Fats Domino. And then plus it had Jane Mansfield in it, which, this terrific looking blonde, and Jeff was just blown away. He couldn't believe it. But the other cool thing that was in that movie were a bunch of guys playing guitars. And that's basically, where he said, I want one of those. I can do one. I can do that. I'd like to do that. That was the beginning of the whole thing.
Jimmy Page is really the catalyst in that second chapter. After Clapton was out of the Yardbirds, Jimmy Page was offered the gig as lead guitarist, declined, suggests that Jeff joined the band. So I wonder, how different do you think rock history would look if Jimmy had simply accepted that Yardbirds job instead of recommending Jeff Beck?
Yeah, it's difficult to predict what would have happened. I mean, these what ifs are very fascinating. I think the thing about Jimmy was he was a bit of a chameleon at that point in his career, and pretty much, throughout Led Zeppelin and everything, he had this massive record collection, and that's really where, Jeff and Jimmy bonded, was, playing guitar and listening to records, like Jeff had probably like about a dozen records, and I think, Jimmy already had a couple hundred at that point. And of course they, met, there were some other characters. There was Stu, for example, who introduced them to the blues, but I think it still would have been cool. It would have been different, definitely.
One of the myths that surround Jeff Beck is that he either quit the Yardbirds or was fired. And the title of chapter 5, "Sorry We Upset You, Now Fuck Off." Please explain that title and help settle the myth. Did Jeff quit? Was he fired?
It was a little bit of both. I mean, here's the thing. Jeff was a complicated guy to begin with. He was a bit of a loner, and he was in the Yardbirds, and he came into them after they had already been, together for a few years. So he was always functioning as a little bit of an outsider. But what we try to make people understand was, why was Jeff so cranky? Why did he have his issues? And really, when you look at touring back then, when you look at the conditions that he had to tour with the Yardbirds, people don't understand it. Like, these guys were traveling day and night in the back of a van. A lot of times when they were traveling, they couldn't even bring their own amps with them. So they had to have this thing sort of written in their riders that the promoter would provide them with amplifiers. And half of the time when Jeff would get to the gig with his guitar, they'd have some really terrible, second-rate blown out amplifier for him to play through. And he was such a perfectionist that this would just drive him crazy. So between the awful touring conditions, the inferior, amplifiers, it wasn't going to make him feel great about what he was doing. And so, he had his mood shifts and his ups and downs. And he had also had some physical problems, like problems with headaches and stuff from an accident that he had when he was a kid. And, the other guys in the band just got sick of it, to be honest with you,
Right.
And he threatened to quit all the time. And one day, after he threatened to basically smash his guitar over the singer's head, they basically showed him the door and let him go. He thought they were going to beg him back, but
right. Yeah. He thought, "Sorry, we upset you. Please come back." But it was instead, it was.
I think the other thing is that, Jeff had this temptation on the side, which was the bikini film starlet Mary Hughes. And he had a little thing going on with her for a while they were on tour over the United States. But of course, her being a film starlet in Hollywood, she was, rather fickle and everything like that. So now that Jeff was free and out of the band, she pretty much lost interest in Jeff too. So, but that was kind of part of the thing too, is he thought, oh, I can just go shack up with Mary Hughes on the beach, in Los Angeles, and Corvettes and la la la, and that didn't really work out.
Chapter 7 is titled "The Moment of Truth." It's one of the most important chapters in the book because it covers the creation and the impact of 1968's Truth, an album many consider one of the blueprints for hard rock and heavy metal. Shapes of Things is slowed down to what Jeff wanted to be like a dirty and evil vibe. It also introduced what became the unmistakable Jeff Beck style. Talk about what we hear just over a minute into that track that really stands out.
The sort of slide parts and
yes,
stuff.
And the Jeff Beck style, the sound that he develops.
I mean, look, I think there's a good argument to be made that it's the first heavy metal record. He's using power chords. He's using a Marshall stack in the studio. He's getting this loud, nasty sound. And then plus you have Ronnie Wood playing this gigantic distorted bass on top of it, And I think that this is what's really interesting is you hear Shapes of Things by the Yardbirds and their version of it, which is cool, which is sort of psychedelic, but still sounds like something out of the Beatles, Beatles era. And then you move 2 years later and he does the same song and he does it with everything that he's learned, and with all of his new equipment and all this sort of bigger distortion and his, after playing live, he creates a completely different sound. And you almost get the whole story of the 60s shifting in the 70s by just listening to those two songs.
Rod Stewart, Ronnie Wood, Nicky Hopkins, Jeff Beck. I mean, that's like a once in a lifetime lineup. The chemistry was incredible, but what changed so quickly? I mean, the band began to fall apart almost as fast as it came together.
Yeah, Jeff, this is kind of a problem that recurs throughout Jeff's career is that, he's the marquee name on the album. And so he's getting the lion's share of the money too. And there was a definite rift. We talked about Van Halen, initially, being all for one for all. And then there comes a point where they decide that, they don't want to share the spoils anymore. Well, that was the onset of the Jeff Beck Group, with those guys. And Jeff was staying in nice hotels. They were staying in dives. And that really, automatically created just a rift between the guys where there was just us against Jeff type of dynamic going on.
Yeah, there was just a story I just heard recently about, it seems maybe most of the bands, it's this way, but Billy Gibbons was talking about, he said none of those guys ever got along. So once an album was done and the tour was over, they wouldn't see each other for like a year or two, which led to the famous story of the beards, which Chris has a very ZZ Top like beard. And neither of them knew they were growing the beard. They were so, and that seems like, I don't know how many bands actually do get along.
Well, again, a lot of it has to do with, there are egos in play, and Jeff was making a little bit more money than the other guys because he was the marquee name. But again, I think that one thing your listeners will get off on when they look at this book, it's sort of like a small capsule on how the world has changed in terms of touring conditions, of playing conditions, of all of that stuff. These guys, it's sort of hard to imagine how they survived, getting from one place to another under the conditions that they did. And, there was times when they weren't making the kind of money that bands do these days. And Ron and Wood and Rod Stewart would say they were practically starving. Like they basically had to bum money off of Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend in order to eat. So they're traveling under terrible conditions. They're barely getting any sleep. They turn up to gigs and the gear's all wonky and everything. And under those conditions, even under the best of conditions, tempers are going to flare. Under the worst of conditions, tempers are really going to flare. Everybody's going to get on each other's nerves. And that's a bit what happens,
I think too, as a British band, the logistics wasn't the same. They didn't realize like how you put together a tour and how they didn't realize how vast the United States actually is. Back then it took you 5-6 days to drive across the length of the United States. So they might have a gig in Texas and then be expected to be, in a short while, maybe the day or the next in California. And that's a hell of a grind to get over there. And they just, the booking, their management didn't really realize what was involved with going from point A to point B. So that created a lot. The weather was hot, and muggy and stuff. And it was very different than being over in, a humid little island, off there in the Atlantic. So that was, again, it was quite a culture change for them, a culture shock.
There's a funny story in the book, speaking of Billy Gibbons, where Billy's talking about how he worshiped the Jeff Beck Group, like the early, wasn't ZZ Top, was Moving Sidewalks, I believe, and how he worshiped Jeff. And Jeff Beck Group came to Texas to play, and Billy's band was warming up for them. And Jeff was trying to figure out, like, literally how he was going to get his gear to the next gig. And Billy's like, well, you can use our van. I mean, they didn't even transportation to get to the next gig.
Yeah, it was very fly by the seat of your pants.
So Billy ended up driving the Jeff Beck Group to their next gig using their.
It was essentially like that for most bands. I mean, Uriah Heep was a guitarist, played with a broken arm. You know, that was like that in those days for most bands. I mean,
it was sort of just like, I guess, any like punk rock band, really, in the 70s or something, or any indie band, hadn't been that structure. So when you read her book, I think that's part of the fun, and that's sort of the interesting thing, is not only do you see the evolution of Jeff Beck, but you see how the whole music industry changed.
Yeah.
I can guarantee you that Epic Records wasn't giving out 10 record deals in the 80s.
Yeah.
That whole thing had changed.
I think one interesting thing too that was doing the research for this book was looking at these photos of these gigs, and you come to the realization that, oh my God, they didn't have a PA system, that everybody had a Marshall stack. Nicky had a Marshall stack. Rod had a Marshall stack. The drummer had a Marshall stack. That was the PA, was a bunch of Marshall stacks. Everybody had an individual one, and I think Jeff had two. Crazy.
Brad Tolinski and Chris Gill, the authors of Blow by Blow, the Jeff Beck Story. So after the success of the original Jeff Beck Group, everything suddenly unraveled, and then came the devastating car accident, which nearly ended Jeff's career. It could have ended his life. How close did he actually come to losing not just his career, but also the ability to play guitar?
It was quite shocking, when Jeff was in the process of breaking up a previous band and maybe starting what would have been Beck, Bogert, and a piece initially, right before he got into this terrible car accident. And he called his management to tell them what happened. And the management thought, which included Peter Grant, by the way, the famous Led Zeppelin manager, that he was just exaggerating, that they would go to the hospital and figure, he was just being a whiny rock star, and he'd have like a Band-Aid around his finger. And instead, they basically found a completely demolished Jeff Beck. He had gotten completely thrown out of his car onto the pavement, cracked his head open, was in a terrible state. And it took him pretty much a year to recover from that, which, if he'd have been a less talented man, might have completely killed his career at that point, because things were moving so fast. It precipitated like tremendous change in the way he was looking at the music world, at his career, while he was recuperating. And people say, well, how come the Jeff Beck Group didn't get big and Led Zeppelin got so big in their place if they were similar, And the truth was that year when Zeppelin exploded, Jeff was in a hospital recuperating. And so the other thing that changed was the way he started looking at music. He had smashed up his head, and he was having these problems with headaches and stuff. And the thought of playing really, really loud music completely, completely stymied him. Like, he did not want to go back out there playing through gigantic Marshall stacks, because he literally didn't think physically he could take it. And during that period of recuperation, he starts thinking more about Motown music, R&B music, funk. He starts really getting into black music to much more of a degree, and not blues either, like literally R&B and dance music. And it changes his whole way of thinking about what he wants to do next. And that's when you get this completely different change of direction. He goes from the Jeff Beck Group the first edition with Rod Stewart, which is sort of proto-metal, to the second version of the Jeff Beck Group that comes out a couple years later, which is almost, it's almost an R&B funk band. There's a black singer, there's a black bass player. Jeff is loving Sly and the Family Stone. And it eventually leads into him doing the sort of fusion, jazzy, funky thing that he came to be known for a little bit later.
Yeah, really changed him. You get that impression. It was almost a different person after that.
Yeah.
One person I should mention too is Simon Napier Bell. He's important. He believed in Jeff, right? He managed the Yardbirds, and then when Jeff was out of the Yardbirds, he managed Jeff.
Yes.
And Simon was on this show, and he kept in communication with Jeff right up until the end, and he had a great deal of respect for him.
Simon first is such an enormously entertaining guy.
He's great. Yeah.
He's got a great Substack. I read it. I still read it all the time, But I think, it was a period where Jeff needed somebody to believe in him. And in some ways, Simon was kind of a weird choice of that, because Simon was this sort of like a little bit like, not your typical hard-nosed rock manager. He was this almost like a party guy, and almost didn't seem to take things seriously. But for whatever reason, he just really loved Jeff. He believed in Jeff's talent. And when everybody started sort of walking away from Jeff, he was the one guy to say, you've got to keep going. And not only do you need to keep going, but I'm going to help you get there.
Beck, Bogart, and Peace, that comes next. Now, that band been talked about for years, and then it finally became reality. And here we go with another what if. He was supposed to record Superstition, but by the time he got to release it, Stevie Wonder had his own version. Talk about what happened. And was Jeff angry with Stevie Wonder?
No, I mean, the story is super complicated. And Chris and I have joked that you could probably write a whole book just on that little sliver. We end up devoting a chapter to it. But like I said, Jeff, after the accident, starts really embracing Black music, R&B, Motown. And in his mind, Stevie was the king of that. I mean, Jeff really believed that, Stevie was, the greatest songwriter on the planet at that point. And so the idea was, Jeff wanted him to produce his record. But Stevie's career was going off like a rocket at that period. And Stevie said, well, I'd love to produce your record because it would be really cool, because it would help me cross over to a white audience. And then, me working with you would help you cross over to a Black audience. And we would both help each other out in that kind of way as well. It would be great. But Stevie just didn't have time to do that. So he said to Jeff, like, look, you play on a couple of tracks and I'll write you a couple of songs because I know you need material. So what comes out of that, to make a long story short, and you have to buy the book to get the whole thing, is that Stevie writes this fantastic song for Jeff. And there's been a lot made out of that, basically saying that the song was so good that Stevie's lawyer basically said, you can't, or Barry Gordy at Motown said, you can't give him that song. But the truth is Stevie was going to give it to him. But again, Jeff sort of blew the opportunity because, again, he was reshuffling his band. And he tried recording that song a couple of times and was dissatisfied with it. And then it took him a while to get his band together. And by the time he finally got the song recorded and out, Stevie's record had already been out for 6 months and he already had a huge hit with the song. Yeah. Stevie's always said, look, I didn't want to take it away from Jeff, but it was sort of Jeff's fault because he didn't take advantage of it when he could. Of course, Jeff's told this story different, but this was closer to the truth as far as I can figure it out. and as far as the various people that we spoke to told it to us.
And Jeff never resented Stevie for it. He always had the utmost respect for Stevie.
Yeah.
And I know there's other people that he worked with where that was definitely not the case. And Jeff would let you know about it, and it was with Stevie, it was always just, he always had a kind word for Stevie no matter what.
Well, Stevie also came through for him on Blow by Blow too.
Well, yeah. And there's another myth around that, whether, Stevie actually participated in recording sessions or not, which I dug really deep into that to figure out what really happened. And, Jeff has a good way of exaggerating some of his Stevie stories. I'll just leave it at that. So, but it's interesting. It's a very interesting chapter. But, Stevie was under, he was signed, sealed, delivered, basically, by his management, his emphasis on the sealed part of things. They had him under lock and key, and they watched his every move. So there's that.
Well, if it hadn't happened, we may not get Because We've Ended as Lovers, right?
Yes.
Right.
A song that Stevie offered to Jeff, and ultimately 1975's Blow by Blow, the album that redefined his career. It was the 1971 Miles Davis album, a tribute to Jack Johnson that he was listening to. He was working on his car, I think, right? And it was.
Yeah. It was actually Jack Johnson, I think it was 1970, actually, if I recall right. But it was, because Jeff had basically was working on the car that he wrecked. It was the T-Bucket Hot Rod, open top, which is why he flew out of it, no seat belts, he just hit something and bam, you're like, it turns into a catapult. But he was trying to fix this car up, and this was when he lived somewhere in Surrey. It wasn't the big house. He didn't move into that till 75, the manor where I went to visit him. But yeah, he was like sitting there, struggling with this car, trying to get it put back together, and it's raining out and the water's coming down into his garage and it's collecting around him, and he's just like, and he hears this sound, and it's John McLaughlin on the intro to that, and if you listen to that, compare it with Freeway Jam side by side, the opening of that, the way the bass line comes in, the guitar, it's Freeway Jam, and Jeff, that was definitely an inspiration for that. But yeah, he kind of put that in his back pocket. He loved that music, and he started, seeking out more fusion music. And it was kind of like a little side thing, a little perversion of sorts, amongst his crew, because he was kind of running around with this funk R&B crowd, and he was around these rock guys when he was with Bogert and Apiece. But on the side, he was listening to this stuff and really loving it. And he was listening to Mahavishnu Orchestra. He listened to John McLaughlin's solo album, which came out in 71. He was listening to Billy Cobham and Stanley Clarke, and all this stuff. And just, I think, when he went with Beck, Bogert, and Apiece, it was a little bit of a rewind for him, because it was something he was supposed to do in 1969 and didn't. And I think Jeff felt like it's a little bit of unfinished business and a what if, but by the time they hit, they were already a little bit passé. That style of rock wasn't quite as popular as it was a few years earlier. So Jeff was behind the curve for once in his career. When that fizzles out and breaks up rather, violently and explosively, he's like, what am I going to do next? And it's like, and Max Middleton, who was a guy who was his sidekick through, all of this, they were gathered together, and it did kind of start actually with Sarita, with Because We've Ended as Lovers. Jeff pulled that record out and presented it to Max and says, what do you think? And Max is like, it would be a really good instrumental. I think we could work up an instrumental arrangement of that, and that's what they did. But yeah, all this stuff is kind of flying around for Jeff, though. He's, listening to McLaughlin and loving it, and this wild, adventurous thing. The Apocalypse album by Mahavishnu Orchestra comes out. That blows Jeff away, and rightfully so, because that record is just amazing sounding to this day. This big, huge orchestra amongst this fiery, progressive fusion music, with McLaughlin just going nuts, and yet being lyrical and beautiful at the same time. And it's produced by George Martin. So, and Jeff's managers, Ernest Chapman and Ralph Baker, they oblige him, and they contact George on his behalf and say, like, would you work with us? And Martin says yes, and boom, blow by blow.
Eric, I think, when we're talking about this stuff, it's sort of like, your head is spinning because the music is changing and Jeff's changing. And to some degree, I think it's, for people, for your listeners that might not be as familiar with Jeff, sort of a way to think about this. is in the 60s, Jeff invents psychedelia. In the 70s, he invents heavy metal. And then funk rock, and then helps launch the fusion thing. Jeff's always like 2 years ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
And maybe the reason why he isn't as famous as Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton and those guys is because rock doesn't always reward those that are ahead of their time. Rock likes it when it's right on time. But Jeff was always a little bit ahead of the curve, always a bit ahead of the curve. And then he somehow hits that sweet spot in the 70s with Blow by Blow and doing this fusion music, which takes little bits of progressive rock, takes bits of jazz, takes, R&B.
A lot of funk.
Things that are funk going on in the culture at that time, including disco, and ties it up into this beautiful package that people can understand.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. What fascinates me, and you are both guitarists, so hopefully you can explain this, but it may be very complicated, but his sound is so unique that when he would guest on a song, I would know immediately it's him. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I don't even know how to describe, but it has such an amazing tone and his feel, the way he played. But I mean, there had to have been a lot that he did to develop that over time. Kind of like, I know, we all love Eddie Van Halen, and Eddie was the one who was perfecting it over years.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we talking as far as equipment, the guitar he used, the just to develop that tone? Because
it was less about the equipment and more about Jeff, to be honest. And it was more about what he was listening to, because, many guitar players will listen to other guitar players. And, I love all these guys out there who can, copy Eddie Van Halen to a T, and they sound just like him. But Jeff was like looking well beyond the guitar. He was looking at all these other sounds. He was looking at vocals. He was looking at horns, even keyboards and what have you. So he was very adventurous with his gear in a kind of a minimalist way, though. It wasn't like this big expansive bunch of pedals. He would just find something and really capitalize. I mean, you go back to the Yardbirds, the first thing that breaks him into the public eye, Heart Full of Soul. He's imitating the sitar player that they hired for the session, it didn't sound powerful enough. So he gets a fuzz box, borrows one from Jimmy Page, who happens to be over in the next studio, and uses that for the session, and it beats Satisfaction out. Everyone says, oh, Satisfaction, the fuzz box, that's what made the fuzz box popular. But Beck was ahead of the curve there. And we see that throughout, where he's using all these new things. He's using an octave box well before anybody, and that's what you hear especially on Blow by Blow and Wired, where it sounds like a synthesizer, and he's sounding like Jan Hammer. So he that's really where a part of it. I mean, yeah, the gear sort of plays a role in it, but it really comes more from his heart and his fingers.
Okay. Yeah, because I always get this image of like sheet metal, like when I like a visual to the sound, it's like pristine, shiny, sharp.
It's very clean and articulated.
Yes.
I think that's a big part of it. And I think for me, where Jeff Beck really becomes the Jeff Beck that we know for the rest of his career. I mean, he's leading up to this point and he's doing all this amazing stuff. But for me, it's Goodbye Pork Pie Hat on Wired, where you hear him, like even on 'Cause We've Ended as Lovers, it's an amazing, lyrical ballad and everything like that. But he's still kind of doing Roy Buchanan, who he tributes, in the credits for that as an influence. And he's doing Roy Buchanan basically. But on Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, you're hearing him play more with his fingers instead of a pick. Did he ditch the pick in the 80s altogether? That was, yeah, by 79, basically,
Right.
that he ditched it altogether. But he was leading up to that. So he was experimenting with that, using the pick and his fingers. And you hear that a lot more on Goodbye Pork by Hat. You hear these little, he overdubs things in very sly ways that in transitions to these different tones and textures that you don't really notice. But he had this little box called a green ringer, and you got to operate that by hand. It's not a stomp box. It's a little tiny box, like the size of a matchbox that plugs either straight into your guitar or into your amp, and you've got to flick it on and off by hand with a switch. And you hear that come into play on that song. And he gets it to growl like a saxophone, which is really, really cool. And that to me is like that's where Jeff really defines himself, finds his purpose in life, so to speak. And then he just expands from there.
Yeah, like John Bon Jovi talks about, and you guys played that clip by Chris, maybe you posted on Instagram, a collage of clips of everybody talking how great he was. And John Bon Jovi, Howard Stern asked him who's the greatest guitarist. He says Jeff Beck, And when
Jimmy Page and Brian May and David Gilmour will all tell you that too.
right,
Yeah.
I mean that's high praise. But when John Bon Jovi came out with that Young Guns 2 soundtrack, and I heard those songs again, just immediately, and they didn't really play it up that Jeff Beck was on it. But I knew immediately it was him.
Yeah.
He just had that distinct sound,
I think to Chris's point though, and he expressed it well, but Jeff looked to other things for inspiration. He didn't look to other guitar players. And that's part of what made his sound, sound unlike any other guitar player.
Yeah. So he's not approaching it as a guitarist so much as it's almost like it's like vocals. It's like he's laying down vocals.
Yeah.
Like,
or even you go back to Ain't Superstitious,
Yeah.
all of a sudden he's
doing
making
dogs and
guitar
cats.
sound like a dog and cat, or
Yeah.
or you listen to Beck's Boogie and he's imitating doorbells, and he's grabbing these incredible sounds from all over the place.
Yeah, his solo on "People Get Ready" with Rod Stewart. It's like it almost brings me to tears listening to that. Goosebumps every time.
So much that he does will bring you to tears. But yeah, going back on that point though, it's he inspired Jimi Hendrix. Now think about this. What was Jimi Hendrix doing before he became Jimi Hendrix? Playing R&B on the Chitlin circuit, basically, and everything. Then he hears Jeff Beck, and he hears Jeff making train whistles, and using his guitar like a drum, and getting all these crazy percussive sounds out of it. And he's doing sirens, and all this other stuff. And Jimmy hears that, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna.
The Yardbirds were 2 years before Purple Haze.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jeff doesn't really get enough credit for, basically giving birth to Jimi Hendrix, essentially. Without Jeff, there would not have been a Jimmy, most likely, or it would have been a very different type of Jimmy.
I never hear that. You don't hear that? Well, I mean, but the other thing is he had his opportunities. He had some high profile opportunities, a tour with Rod Stewart and then one with Mick Jagger. But then prior to that, he was almost in the Rolling Stones after Mick Taylor was out? How close did that come to happening?
I think it came closer than most. It's funny because I've talked with a number of people over the years who were also, in consideration during that period. Wayne Perkins in particular. I have to dig out my tape of him. Unfortunately, he stopped my tape recorder with all the really juicy details. But it's a fascinating period. But I think they really had their eye on Jeff initially. The thing is, it never would have worked, and Jeff knew it. And if you go online and you dig around a little bit, you can find some of these bootlegs out there, and it's really kind of like it's just a horrible mismatch. They're doing Freeway Jam, and it just sounds goofy. It doesn't have this grandeur and this funkiness and this drive to it. It's just kind of dump ba dump ba dump ba dump. They're playing this little Chuck Berry rhythm in the background. He's do 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 do. It's just kind of da 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 da. It's almost like you can see like a Looney Tunes cartoon, going along with it or something. Porky Pig beating up Bugs Bunny, or whatever. It just didn't work. But Jeff gave it a try, and thank God he didn't, because I mean, he had Blow by Blow in his pocket. It was done. And then he went off on this tour with McLaughlin. And just imagine that we would have missed out on that, which was amazing for people who saw it. I missed it, unfortunately. I was just a little bit too young. But it was amazing, this fertile period and how they inspired each other and everything. And, otherwise he just would have been another guy in the Rolling Stones. I'm not to say, not to put down Ronnie Wood, who ended up getting the gig eventually, but it just wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, Ronnie compliments
He had the
Keith.
correct haircut. I mean,
Yeah.
let's face
Yeah,
it.
that's. I mean, really, Ronnie Wood, Jeff Beck, and Rod Stewart. It's like, are they brothers or what?
They've got the same hairstylist.
Really,
basically.
they look like twins. Got to look into that. But yeah, he had those opportunities. His relationship with Rod Stewart is, it's the stuff of legend, man. I mean, it's like the music they made together, but they couldn't. I mean, he was supposed to tour with Rod, and it lasted like 9 shows.
Yeah.
Well, back to the Stones thing. I mean, I actually talked with Keith Richards a couple years ago, shortly after Jeff died, and I asked him, about playing with Jeff when Jeff auditioned for the band, or not auditioned, but jammed with them. And even Keith said to me, look, I think Mick was hoping for it, to happen, because Mick was a huge Jeff Beck fan. And in fact, Jeff played on some of Mick's solo stuff later on. But the way Keith put it, which is accurate, is he said, look, Jeff Beck is a genius, but he's his own man, and the Rolling Stones are a band.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a difference. I mean, the thing that you have to look at Jeff Beck through a kind of lens is maybe the current rock star that people might think of is somebody like Neil Young. Whereas Neil, he never stayed with one band. Neil just kept on changing, and every time he would change, he would bring in a new group of guys to suit that, and maybe drift back to some of the older guys, but he was always like, depending on how he felt, he would find the right musicians to complement what he was doing. And that's not a very rock and roll idea. I mean, most rock and roll is, right, you get in with your band of brothers and you stick together for 30 years until you kill each other, that kind of, whereas Jeff was like, nah, I'm moving in a different way. I think I want some other people. And, from the outside, you look at that and say, well, that makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, sometimes when you're that guy that gets shoved aside, that creates some bad blood as well, So sometimes Jeff did get maybe the bad rap from people just because Jeff decided it was time for him, to move on.
Because I don't think he really was interested in being a pop star or a famous.
I think he would have loved to have that happen, but only if it came out in terms.
On his own terms. Yes.
Yeah. And that was the thing, is that his own terms were an entirely different thing than what the general public wanted at the time.
Right.
So, but yeah, going back to the Rod Stewart thing, one of my favorite quotes from Jeff is like, Rod and I have a love-hate relationship. Rod loves me and I hate him.
But it's like infatuation and people get ready. I mean, those songs, they're just phenomenal, that chemistry they had. But what was at the core of their battles?
Well, Rod was a superstar,
right?
And Jeff was a hired gun, and Jeff just ain't a hired gun.
Yeah, that's what he said with Mick Jagger, right? Like you write in the book, like he's thinking, oh, cool, we're gonna have our own project here, like
yeah.
But he's like, instead, I'm Mick's guitarist.
Yeah.
The weird thing with him and Rod was that their roles sort of changed, and it was difficult for both of them. Because back when Rod was originally playing with Jeff, Jeff was the big kahuna. He was or as Jeff would call it, Billy Big Bananas. Jeff was the Billy Big Bananas. And Rod was sort of the secondary person. So when Rod emerged as the gigantic superstar, that power dynamic shifted. And it was hard for Jeff to adjust to that. And Rod wasn't about to take backseat to Jeff either. So there were just, ego clashes. They actually recorded, or it was reported anyways, that they recorded an entire record together much later on.
Yeah.
And
I remember that.
And
was that late 90s, early 2000s or not?
Yeah. And then Rod just decided he didn't he didn't want to finish it. He just didn't want to go there, you know. And it had to do with their chemistry. And Rod admitted, I mean, he did say, look, you know, I want things my way and Jeff wants it his way.
Yeah.
And we just weren't lining up, you know.
One funny episode I remember just talking about this was when I went over and interviewed him in '92, and it was, you know, during that downtime where we were just kind of chatting and stuff, and you know, we were talking about Rod Stewart, you know, just kind of off the record and everything like that. And Ralph Baker's manager was just like, oh, you know, Rod's got this new record, he's crooning, he's doing all these standards and everything like that. And this was when Jeff was doing, you know, Crazy Legs, which was the very accurate duplicate of Gene Vincent. You know, and it was just kind of funny. It's like, well, you're both doing retro things. Why can't you guys see eye to eye? And it's like, well, he's just doing a bunch of pop shit, and I'm doing the real deal, you know?
Well, the decade ended well, though, with the Stevie Ray Vaughan tour.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how did he get along with Stevie Ray?
Famously, really, really well. Those guys just, they admired each other, you know, and I think that was a real kick for them both. You know, just to go up there and be around each other and to be playing and everything like that. But, you know, Jeff does have his privacy about him. He does have his private moments, and he could be a bit cagey. I think there was something that didn't make the book. It was on the cutting room floor, but Chris Layton talking about, you know, Jeff playing Happy Birthday for him. You know, like he said, like Jeff barely said a word to me. And then one day he shows up in my dressing room and plays Happy Birthday for me. And then the next day he was just like walking past me in the hall and doesn't even acknowledge my presence, you know?
I think Jeff loved that Stevie challenged him.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't Stevie. I mean, Jeff wasn't that way. He liked when other guitarists gave him some shit, you know, gave him something to bump up against. And in the early 1990s, I did an interview with both Jeff and Jimmy Page together, and they both brought their guitars with them, which was incredible to witness. And at one point, you know, Jeff takes out his Strat and he just starts playing the most ridiculous shit. I mean, you know, he's just playing this crazy rockabilly stuff with his fingers and doing all this stuff. And then he stops and he knows he's just killed it. And he turns to Jimmy and says, hey, what do you have to show me?
Well, it's like the arms concert.
And Page just went, he just lifted his hands up. Like, I do.
Yeah, I do want to mention the arms concerts too, which we got Clapton, Beck, and Page all together, you know, for a handful of shows there in '83. And of course, Beck is the one who came out, you know, dominating it, and it was in a friendly way and everything like that. But Jeff kind of knew that, yeah, I kicked their asses, you know, and I think that kind of it gave him a lift. Unfortunately, it was a period where everything was kind of down, and they're trying to again. They were trying like Mickey Most did with Hi Ho Silver Lining. They're trying to make him a pop star again, and that just didn't work.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. What kind of relationship did he have with Eddie? Speaking of Van Halen, were they?
They admired each other. Jeff, you know, Jeff is not like a lot of guitar players, you know, who like to cut down other people, you know, and criticize them. Jeff loved everybody, and he was kind of intimidated actually by the new breed. As when I talked with him in you know, '99, and he was, you know, Satriani and Vai were major superstars by that point, and he was kind of like, I feel intimidated by those guys, and you know, I can't keep up. But at the same time, I remember, you know, a few months later, I'm at the Hard Rock at the Joint in Las Vegas, and I turn around, and who's behind me? Steve Vai, you know, there to see Jeff Beck, you know, and went back and met with them, you know, after the show and everything like that. And Steve was just all like, you know, it's like he was meeting with the Pope or something, wanted to kiss Jeff's ring, you know. But yeah, Eddie loved Jeff. Jeff loved Eddie. There was no jealousy, there was no rivalry between those guys, and Lukather, add Lukather to the bunch, man. And it's like, gosh, you want to talk about, every, mailbox in Hollywood probably got busted that night, um, from their antics. But no, they really were all kind of part of this clan, this group, that got along together, and of course being car enthusiasts too. So there was that as well.
Oh yeah.
Well, I like to sort of point this out too, is that, I mean, I knew that Ed listened to Wired a lot, like that record in particular, because I think also like that was the record where Jeff really started embracing the Strat and using the whammy bar in all sorts of really super interesting ways. And I just ask you to look at the cover of Wired and how Jeff Beck's hair is and how his haircut, and compare that to the first Van Halen record.
Oh yeah. Wow. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's cool.
And the timing of it all, because, Ed was pretty much playing guitars without whammy bars, up until the mid 70s. And all of a sudden Beck comes along and Wired and, even some of Blow by Blow. And, what's Eddie got? A Strat, 76.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I think you've answered the question. I mean, yeah, he could be demanding, stubborn, frustrating to work with, but time and time again, the best musicians in the world wanted to work with him continually.
Yeah. I mean, so, really look at it, on some ways people want to downplay Jeff, but the guy won 8 Grammys. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. And not only that, but, during the course of a 50 or 60, year career, he was still playing large venues and pretty much entertaining people with just a guitar in his hand. I mean, so it's funny. It's almost hard to square the fact that he didn't have big hit records and wasn't like this big songwriter, but there was no point in his career that he couldn't go into a large hall and fill it with people who just wanted to hear him play the guitar.
And imagine this, he goes to Japan in the late 70s with Stanley Clarke, and it's like Beatlemania. Imagine that. Imagine Beatlemania for a fusion band. Imagine that. How crazy that. And to this day, the Japanese are crazy about Jeff Beck.
Moving into the 90s a bit more, the press often portrayed him in the 80s and again in the 90s as somebody basically preferred tinkering with hot rods to making music. But your research paints a very different picture. He's constantly recording, collaborating, and experimenting. The Roger Waters project, there's another one. Some movie projects, and he toured with Carlos Santana. Why do you think that myth became like so much bigger than reality? I mean, he was busier than ever in the 90s.
Well, the thing is that he didn't have big projects to promote. And that was kind of part of our big task in this book, was to fill those spaces. Because, Jeff would do interviews, but he would do them when usually he had an album out, and his albums went from like 3 years to 5 years to 10-year spans. You had these big voids in between. Now, I was really lucky, after that interview I did with him in 92, because I talked with him a lot, and I would find out about something and it'd be an item in Guitar Player or Guitar World, and I would just call him up and talk with him for 5, 10, maybe even a half hour about some project. So I had little bits and pieces of stuff, but, you find out about these things, and it's like, well, what really did happen? I was really lucky actually in the Roger Waters thing, because I had talked with him, and because I had that 3 hours with him, and that's one of the things we talked about, because he didn't really do any interviews about that particular album, and yet it's important part of what he did. But yeah, it's kind of a lazy journalistic thing to just say like, well, we don't know what Jeff did, so he built hot rods, and that was kind of like, it became a cliche to say like, oh, in between this time he did no albums and he just worked on his hot rods. Well, he always had guitars around. And if he talked with his domestic partners, they said there was guitars in every room, and he would sit down to eat dinner and he'd have a guitar in his lap, and he'd sit down to watch television and he'd have a guitar in his lap, and he'd be playing along and like creating soundtracks to the television show, and he'd come out from the garage with his hands all covered in oil and pick up the guitar and start playing. And he had projects, constant projects. And the fascinating thing about Jeff is not so much what he put out, but what he didn't put out, what didn't meet his muster. In talking about that period in the 90s, yeah, you had that. I got to watch him work on the Muddy Water Blues thing with Paul Rogers. Not with Paul Rogers. He'd already done the tracks and Jeff was just laying down guitar, but he was working on that record. And you look at it, and it's like, gosh, he had all these sessions that he did. Then he had the record with Lukather that he was working on in the later part of the 90s, and then he decides to ditch all that and go fusion. But there was always something going on. And there's an album with Stuart Copeland that he was doing in that period too.
Really?
Yeah, it goes on and on and on. I mean,
Wait a minute. I love Stuart Copeland. What did this ever come out?
No, no, and unfortunately, it never will. And that's the sad thing about it is like if Jeff didn't put it out in the first place, he didn't want it out, and that's kind of in his will that this stuff shall not be released. And unfortunately, Mother Nature had a bit of a role in that, and there was a flood at his house, and a bunch of those tapes got destroyed.
What year was the Stuart Copeland project?
That was about 95, 96, if I recall properly.
Wow,
So that was
because
like
then
right after the Santana, tour.
okay, and then Stuart Copeland did the Oysterhead with
Yeah, with
Les
that's a little bit
Claypool.
later. Oysterhead was I remember because I saw Oysterhead. That was after 9/11. I remember I
Okay,
saw that.
okay.
It's right around that period.
Wow. I would
But
love
think
to hear
about it,
that.
Eric. I mean, we've already talked about a record that he did at Motown Studios that doesn't get released. We talk about another record with Beck Bogert and a piece that doesn't get released.
The Sly Stone project that gets killed.
Flystone project that gets killed. A record with Rod Stewart that gets killed. A record with Steve Lukather. But he made sure that the airwaves or his reputation, or however you want to look at it, did not get filled with garbage. Because he could have put out a bunch of mediocre records, and we'd be maybe looking at him the same way that we look at somebody like, like an Yngwie Malmsteen, who does these sort of groundbreaking records, but then just puts out a bunch of like, who cares?
Dilutes the legacy or
Dilutes the legacy. And Jeff just had an iron grip. Even though he could have done anything and had the rights to do anything under his record contract, he had this high standard. And luckily everything that we hear has a certain quality about it.
Yeah. So his estate has to respect that, whatever his wishes were, that they're
Yeah.
not going to put that
Yeah.
stuff out. So do you think, because I mentioned you had it coming 2000, but then also I remember the rock station here in Connecticut was playing What Mama Said,
Mhm.
and it had that clip of It's a Mad World. And I just thought, this is so great. This is so cool. But I remember thinking maybe the older generation of Beck fans might be turned off by it. What his fan base, did they welcome that?
Yes and no. I mean, first of all, it's just got tons of Jeff Beck guitar playing on it. So
Right.
You can't really deny that. And he always has these nuggets on there. On that particular record, Angel Footsteps, that's a continuation of what he did with Where Were You, and just this amazing lyrical thing, and he still manages to put, a bluesy song, Brush with the Blues, on there, and he just, and those records were kind of still a mixed bag. So he did have, stuff in that kind of modern electronica-ish direction, but then he also had some chestnuts in there for the old fans too. So I think, if you got through the record, you would find a lot of stuff that was really worth digging into. You just had to do the work, you had to dig into it. And
His
really
fans went along for the ride with him then.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Last question is his collaboration with Johnny Depp, which surprised a lot of people. Brad, you mentioned interviewing Johnny Depp near the very end of the project.
Yes.
Was there anything that Johnny shared that maybe gave you a new perspective on Jeff?
Well, the thing that strikes me, I mean, this is more of my perspective, and then we'll get around to what Johnny had to say. But in some ways, it's a last record. It shouldn't have been his last record, 18 with Johnny Depp. But in some ways, it ended up being kind of an interesting summation, and ended up kind of touching on different areas of Jeff's career. I think it's sort of a terrific overview. And the interesting thing about it to me was the friendship that Jeff had with Johnny. And Jeff was pretty much a loner. He didn't really build, close relationships with a lot of musicians. He was always changing bands. And that's the one record that Jeff, I never heard him say anything negative about. Like he loved that record. And I think it had to do with his friendship and how easy the collaboration was with Johnny.
That's 18.
Yes.
You took, yeah, 18.
I mean, with Johnny, from his perspective, it was more like Jeff reaching out and giving him a helping hand. So Johnny was super grateful. They didn't set out to make a record. What happened was Johnny was sort of in a bad place. He was going through divorce. There was a lot of controversy in his life, and he took refuge at Jeff's house and lived at Jeff's house for on and off for a good 6 months. And the one thing that people don't understand about Johnny is he basically started out as a musician. He had bands in Florida when he was a kid and then in LA, and then his career took this other shift. So in some ways, Johnny is a musician that acts like in his own head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know, for whatever reason, those two gave each other a safe place to create. And they really, really liked what they did together. And Johnny was grateful that somebody of Jeff's magnitude would work with him and accept him as an equal, as a musician. And this was, profound for him.
Yeah, I can imagine. He must have been devastated when Jeff died. I mean, it was sudden.
The one thing that I got from my conversation with him, which went on for a couple of hours actually, was sort of what a cool, down-to-earth, unpretentious sort of guy he was. But it's interesting when you look at who Johnny Depp's friends are, they're the great eccentrics. They're the great geniuses of our time. Like he was great friends with Hunter S., the great writer Hunter S. Thompson. He was friends with Marlon Brando. I mean, who's friends with Marlon Brando? So I think that there was he could relate to Jeff as an artist. Jeff could relate to him as an artist. And they just had a great creative chemistry together. Regardless of what you think of the record,
January 10th, 2023, he died suddenly, and it felt like we were losing somebody who was still creating.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
on tour, he was just as good as ever, if not better, still reaching, still hadn't lost a step, wasn't stumbling at all. Just phenomenal, and you think that, he was almost 80 years old, and he was just, and I've seen guys like Les Paul when they were 80 years old. I mean, Les unfortunately had arthritis and stuff, so that kind of held him back. But you see some of these guys, they get up in their 60s and 70s and stuff, and they start losing it, but Jeff never lost it at all. And it was shocking to me. I mean, as we kind of knew, and we discovered it more as we dug into this project of, he had health problems. He had numerous bouts of extreme sickness, and illness and periods. And that was actually probably what held him up more than working on Hot Rods, was actually periods where he was waylaid by an injury or an illness of some sort. So it wasn't entirely a shock, but still he was so vital and youthful, which is, I think, why the album was called 18, because, Johnny, they said they felt like they were 18 years old when they were hanging out with each other.
He was very youthful. Very youthful.
I had just hung out with Jeff and Billy Gibbons maybe a year before he died. And there was no sense of any kind of frailty, in Jeff. So, yeah, it was surprising.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. Blow by Blow, the Jeff Beck Story, out July 14th, which means it's out tomorrow. We're recording this on the 13th, so by the time this episode's out, the book will be out. Find it wherever books are sold, and look for it at your nearest bookstore. Look for your nearest independent bookstore at bookedonrock.com. And guys, where can people find you online? Chris, I know you. I'm on your Instagram page, and Brad, your Facebook page.
Well, I've got a cool Substack too for people that want to keep up called Guitarland. I'm basically putting stuff up there every week.
Yeah, and Brad's inspiring me. I've been reading some Substacks about Eddie Van Halen stuff, and it's like, I've wanted to do an Eddie Van Halen Mythbuster series because there are so many myths that perpetuate on and on to this day, and people still can't get over the first album. And it's like, it's a lot more simple than you think, So maybe it's my calling to do that. Maybe that's what I'll do in my golden years.
Yeah, Chris, you are the go-to man for making sure that the facts are straight. You got to be excited about the project with Alex, and it's all instrumentals, I believe. I don't think they're going to find a vocalist.
I am pensively excited about it. I love Alex, but I don't know if he's got the right perspective on this thing. Who has the right perspective other than Eddie? And he's not around to do that anymore. But I don't want to go on. We can go on about this, but just from what I know, it's just the leftover tracks from A Different Kind of Truth. And Ed had told me that they had about 16 things that were unfinished. That were just basically instrumental tracks. Is really they were waiting on Roth to come up with ideas, which was often a thing with the band. But I'm interested. I will definitely give it a listen, and I'm hoping it's going to be great.
Yeah, well, congratulations on this book. Jeff Beck deserves a book like this, and nobody better to do it than you guys. So thank you for coming on, and thank you for a phenomenal book.
Thanks, Eric. This is always a blast.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
That's it. It's in the books.